So thank you all for coming today. We'd like to introduce the project Knowledge Exchange Corridors, UCSD Community Stations Initiative. And the UCSD Community Stations is a community outreach initiative that will introduce a series of collaborative projects among university researchers and various social service and community-based cultural agencies in San Diego. And so there are two joint ventures that frame this initiative. The first is the Center for Community and Well-Being, affiliated with the Division of Social Science and led by Mike Cole. It will partner with the San Diego Workforce Partnership South Metro Career Center to focus on issues pertaining to community health, service and education, and technology job training. The second joint venture is the Center for Urban Ecologies, affiliated with the Division of Arts and Humanities and led by Teddy Cruz. It will partner with Casa Familiar, a social service and cultural agency located in San Ysidro, to focus on community-based arts and public culture, affordable housing, and inclusive urban development. So these two joint ventures, working closely with Cal IT2 and the Cal IT2 generated technology infrastructure, aim to build new corridors of communication, collaboration, resource sharing, and knowledge exchange. Corridors that will connect the specialized knowledge of the university and the ethical knowledge embedded in communities in order to generate a new form of urban pedagogy. So the exhibition has two components. The first one you've already no doubt noticed. It's focusing on illustrating the various dimensions of the initiative, the existing sites, actors, programs, as well as projected future activities. And the second component of the exhibition is a summer program that involves 4 weeks of dialogues and exchanges among each of the communities involved and UCSD, mediated by the Opta Portable that will be coordinated by instructors at each location. So we're very pleased to have the leaders and co-founders of these joint ventures here today. Michael Cole is Distinguished Professor of Communication Psychology and Human Development at UCSD. He focuses on the role of culture and human development with a background in both experimental psychology and cognitive anthropology. He researches the design of community-based development enhancing environments for children from diverse cultural and social class backgrounds. The focus of his current work is the creation of university community partnerships to promote community well-being. Teddy Cruz is a professor in public culture in the visual arts department here at UCSD. His work focuses on the particularities of the San Diego-Tijuana border region and the integration of theoretical research, pedagogy, and design production. His work complicates physical and cultural barriers, focusing on under-recognized minority and immigrant communities and spaces, and the transformation of border neighborhoods through informal architectures and public infrastructures. So we'll begin with a short presentation by Teddy and Mike, and then we'll open things up for a conversation, and then we will then break for food, wine, and our reception. So maybe we'll start. Mike, would you like to start?
I'm pushing off on Teddy.
Okay, Teddy. All right.
He comes first. I'll push it off.
Okay. Well, in reality, we were not necessarily prepared to give a formal presentation. I think it's important to make it an open conversation about the nature of this initiative. And as an initiative, of course, it's truly initiating itself because it's really unfolding as we speak. I mean, this is something that has been in construction in terms of conversations throughout maybe the last year or two, but in terms of coming together to formulate this series of programs that will be very essential as devices to connect the university and community. It's a work in progress, okay? But I wanted to just begin by saying, of course, this is an initiative that has been enabled, I think, by Ramesh Rao, who really, being the cultural pimp that he is, brings together different characters and possibilities from different sectors, I think, at the university, and this is what really began this whole thing. And I should say this because this is essential, because we sometimes sort of scratch our heads how to really enable some of these projects that can really produce a very different idea of outreach, when in reality these projects already exist. I mean, I think that many of us, and not only Mike and I, but many other faculty members who have been engaged in communities with very interesting projects already for a long time, are not necessarily that made visible. And I think that one first thing that I would like to say quickly is that this project, in a way, sort of framing something that is existing, and in so doing, enable a kind of level of visualization and ultimately of enacting more formal exchanges, not only between us as faculty members in terms of what we're doing, but also with these communities. So I wanted to begin by saying that this is a kind of way of recognizing that there are many bottom-up efforts across many different departments that need to really be brought up and framed intelligently. And this is probably the ability of Ramesh and Kalaititu in this case. I wanted to also say that, of course, these efforts, let's say Center for Urban Ecologies, this is a kind of a spillage of another effort that is embedded in the Visual Arts Department. When the Visual Arts Department decides to maybe begin an initiative called Public Culture by Steve Fagan and as chair years ago, but that began to really investigate other types of, how would I call it, the spheres of operation outside the very proper, more formal specializations of art, and not only in terms of art production, but art in terms of display and so on. Connecting the Visual Arts Department to other worlds, to the communities, to the border, to many other issues that sometimes remain peripheral to our discussion inside the university. So I don't want to go on and on about this, but all I'm trying to say is this is really part of a more organic and a kind of organic unfolding of our necessity as an institution to connect outside our borders, our kind of intellectual gated community here, and to really understand that there is an amazing amount of knowledge that is made operative at the scale of communities, neighborhoods, border issues here. In my case, and maybe Mike, of course, will elaborate on the Center for Community Wellbeing, the Center for Urban Ecologies emerged as a public culture initiative began in the Visual Arts Department. Keon Park, who is a colleague of mine in the department, we've co-founded this center because we all both come from architectural studies, architecture and urbanism. In a university where that lacks the possibility of a school of architecture, I think this was an opportunity to bring up not only curricular activity pertaining issues of urbanization and architecture or spatial practice, environmental practice. So the Center for Urban Ecologies began to enable the possibility of thinking of activating what I think is very particular as a kind of almost urgent condition in our time is the elevation of a kind of civic culture, the understanding of the possibility of a civic imagination that emerges only by producing these types of interfaces. So the idea of an urban pedagogy that enables the visualization of policy at the scale of the urban, that enables a rethinking of housing, and not only as just objects of units of housing, but really a more complicated notion of housing in terms of socioeconomic sustainability and many other things. I don't want to really go too much in detail about this, but that really began to bring the work that I've been developing with this particular community, which is San Isidro, by a collaboration that I have really developed in the last 10 years with a nonprofit community organization grounded in this neighborhood. And as I really, in the last 10 years, began to develop a very interesting relationship with this nonprofit, I began to realize the amazing untapped possibilities that these neighborhoods contain. Of course, I'm talking about what has been called ethical knowledge, but the kind of creative intelligence that really is embedded in these environments, immigrant neighborhoods, where that begin to propose very interesting issues of collaboration, of sustainability, really enabled by social organization, alternative programming, alternative economies, and so on. So I've been interested in my studies in the impact, I would say, the positive impact of immigration in the rethinking or the transformation of the American neighborhood. So particularly the work really then began to develop with Casa Familiar in rethinking housing policy, in rethinking the role of infrastructure, public space at the scale of neighborhoods. So in a kind of organic unfolding, my relationship to Casa Familiar as an architect, developing different types of housing configurations, began to consolidate what has become a very interesting research project. You know, I'm particularly here in UCSD when we go for promotion, many of these engagements, in fact, I've had problems about this, I shouldn't really voice it too much, but a lot of the work that I've been developing in these neighborhoods can be labeled social service, when in reality it's a fundamental part of my research. And I think that the rethinking of certain protocols within the university in the context of the importance of this knowledge and these interfaces needs to be amplified. So that's what really began to produce this possibility, I think, that more and more, as is obvious, that we all operate in terms of silos in our own kind of camps, that more needed to be said and done in terms of the connection between this creative intelligence, that we can loosely call it, or this knowledge embedded in these communities, organized and mobilized by activists that do not have the credentials to be part of our university community, and somehow how to bring that knowledge to enter the university. At the same time, how the university can contact those communities with resources and support systems and so on. So I think it was a very clear possibility that we needed to articulate these corridors of knowledge exchange, but not only hopefully rhetorically, because of course this is loaded. And Mike, at some point, we were exchanging emails about these exhibitions, like, what do we mean by urban pedagogy? I mean, this is loaded with all these slogans. You know, we have to make it operative in a way, in a sense. So this is what interests me, and I maybe should end with this, because there are many other things that we can talk about it, and maybe that's part of the conversation, is that I'm interested in how we can together, in terms of this association or relationship, design those particular interfaces. Because many of these projects are just, you know, initiated, and some lack funding, some lack administrative kind of, you know, but at the end of the day, they remain sort of emblematic or just symbolic of something. I think what is needed here is a very fine, how would I call it, tuning, or the very specific kind of calibration of what those programs can do. And they require design. I think this is an act of design. So for example, what I'm trying to say is that one of the programs that we've been discussing might be called public scholarship, where we pair activists and professors to co-teach seminars. And maybe I will be teaching a seminar with Andreas Corepa, who is the social organizers of Casa Familiar, maybe you know, with my call, and maybe the seminar will be called on citizenship, immigration, and property. And we will begin to mix issues, you know, that theoretically frame the issue of citizenship in the context of particular historical lineages, but at the same time is really is made tangible in terms of case studies that are very clear and concrete inside these communities. So that's just an example, but we need to design that protocol. How does a public scholarship would function? So when you go to the exhibition, there was an attempt to do 4 little vignettes of how this public scholarship might operate. Similarly, public mentorship. Saura, who is, you know, part of the Center of Community Well-being team, has been enamored with this idea, which I also feel is something that I've been wanting to do, of thinking that maybe a graduate student might sign a social contract with 3 teenagers in San Isidro to follow each other for a year. So the teenagers all of a sudden become urban guides of the student into the community, and at the same time, the graduate students become mentors to them. So this, again, this is exchanges and interfaces. This is what I was saying is work in progress, because the next step, and we are very appreciative that all of a sudden there is a platform to begin sharing these intentions. The next step is Mike and I, and the team, and everybody collaborate, and Deborah Forrester, who has been essential to this in conceptualizing these relationships, that we sit down and begin to design the specificity of those protocols, so that they can begin to operate more, and again, in a more tangible way. Because Mike always, you know, and I will pass it to you, when we get together, he always reminds us, you know, this is about the community. This is about the effect, the tangible effect it can really be produced in these people, in advancing and improving a way of being, in terms of, you know, everyday kind of practices. So Mike.
Okay. So when I started down here, my granddaughter asked me, where are you going? I said, I'm going to this art installation that I have something to do with down. She said, Grandpa, you're not an artist. What are you doing that for? So I'm from the School of Social Sciences. And since 1981, I've been taking undergraduates into community settings outside of formal state institutions, community settings, so community centers, sometimes schools, after schools, churches. Right now, a major place that we work is a HUD housing center. And to create, using my own background in developmental psychology and cultural psychology and communication, to try to figure out how to create useful environments not only for the children in the community, and not only for their parents, but for our UCSD undergraduates as well. So when you go into the exhibit, you'll see that just pay attention to what this means in terms of undergraduate education. And I think that's something I'd like to be able to talk about going forward. In terms of this, I'll say a little bit about the Center for Community Wellbeing. First of all, I'm only the leader sitting here, right? I'm big into threes, and there's a kind of a troika that is involved in starting the Sukumar, sitting right here in the front row, and Bud Meehan, the ex-head of CREATE, and still active member of the Center for Community Wellbeing. I never thought in my entire life I'd be associated with something called the Center for Community Wellbeing. I didn't think up that name. I think actually Sukumar did, and I think it was appropriate. And the basic motivation here is that 4 years ago, I've been doing this for a long time, but I was taken into the southeastern San Diego community by invitation 4 years ago into in this housing center. And in order to be able to live there, you have to be poor. That's earns you the right to be there, unless you get too poor, which a lot of the people do, in which case they have to leave again and go move in with family. So there's downward mobility at the same time that the purpose of our activities and others is to create something like upward mobility if we can. And I take my sort of educational activities with computers and a little bit of networking stuff, so you can see the communication angles coming in there. I'm a big skeptic about technologies, I got to tell you. Workarounds, 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 as I have been saying all day. That's what the name of the game is. But going down there and working with the children. But now, not in a school set apart, not in a Boys and Girls Club where the parents drop their kids off so that they don't have to pay any attention to them, but a community center made out of 2 apartments with 1 part-time person running it, with kids from age 5 to 20, if you can call them kids, kids and youth. We don't have a good category for that. Coming in and out of the door all of the time. And we started to try to make good educational activities for them, only what if they have severe illnesses? What do you do then? How can they concentrate on what they're doing? What if they don't have, what if they eat really lousy food? And part of the reason they eat lousy food is there's no fresh food to be found except at the 99-cent store that they can get to unless they take 2 buses. Then what do you do? So in terms of, quotes, making a difference for the community, it was clear that the little piece that we were doing, maybe it's nice, people visit, people feel good about it, but it isn't really doing anything, right? And so I just invited people to say, hey, look at this situation. Don't you think there may be some research and teaching opportunities there for you? People in the School of Medicine, people, Keith Pizzoli is here from Urban Studies, and really the Center for Community Wellbeing came about. It's a kind of mini promised neighborhoods, kind of this big macro programs like the Harlem Zone Project. But now the difficulty with those kinds of projects is they all require external funding from philanthropists. And as soon as that external funding stops, all gone. So for me, for a long time, for maybe 25 years here at UCSD now, I've been trying to trick this institution into setting up relations such that we treat the community settings as legitimate arenas for research for faculty. It is for me. For their graduate students, it is for my graduate students. For the undergraduate students, it is, in their own testimony, go look at it, it is. Now, fund it. How do you fund it? In UCSD terms, University of California terms, it means funding things at the level of what Teddy would call a studio course, and what in communication we call a practicum course. That requires something like one professor or one certified person you can pay who can do it, and probably a TA, minimally to do it. Now, that doesn't fit the model of my department, nor most of the departments on campus, which really would prefer that I was standing in front of 300 students lecturing to them. Maybe we could put the stuff up on, online or what have you afterward, but it still is 300 to 1. We understand that economic model. What we don't understand is a model that will allow us to give first-class education to our students. So one of the things I am as a member of the National Academy of Education. I'm supposed to promote education. And I get very distressed about the kind of, excuse me, I'm sitting here at UCSD, but I get distressed about students who in their senior year have done nothing but sit in large classes and be able to do multiple choice questions. They're social scientists, not a single laboratory. Going out in social sciences, we would not send a biologist out of here without ever seeing a biology laboratory. We'd never send a physicist or a chemist out of here without having a laboratory. We have no funding model that will support this for the social sciences or its equivalent for the humanities. So the reason I jumped on this and I got very excited about it is, Teddy's absolutely correct. It was Ramesh who brought us together. I met Teddy first in Ramesh's office, and he drew this line from Casa Familiar down to UCSD and called it corridors of knowledge. And he started to talk about exchange. I said, oh, that's very interesting. Okay, I'm interested in that kind of thing too, but we have down near the border, we have the Latino community primarily living in that area. In the area that we work in, it's historically an African-American part of San Diego. We have here at UCSD, it's primarily anything else but either of those two kinds of categories, lots of other categories. And I really dream of the time when we can start to teach from multiple locations. In the fall, if the God of technology willing, but in some form, with whatever workarounds, I will be teaching a course in communication, practicum course with I'm going to have 3 talented helpers, and you'll see a little bit of what it is we did in the spring that I think is first-class education. We certainly have given Cal IT2 a good workout in what it means to design optoportables and place them in a community that doesn't have the infrastructure to be able to bear the weight of it. So that there's learning going on, I think, and constantly back and forth with engineering and with the TIES program, trying to get people to understand what design means. Seriously, what design means. Not to over-design, not to waste money. And then this big issue, and how do we fund these kinds of activities at UCSD? I'm a senior professor, Teddy is too, but what about the assistant professors coming along who will get trashed if they do collaborative research, will get trashed if they do stuff that's seen only as community service. So we do have, I'm an old jerk this way, we have I graduated from the University of California, right? The University of California has a 3-fold mission. We all know about it. Research, teaching, and community service. We all know what you'll get promoted for or retained here for, and it doesn't have to do with the last 2, unless you're an egregiously bad teacher, right? So what I think this project does, legitimately, is to fulfill the 3-fold mission of the University of California. So that's sort of my interest in it. In the activities that we engage in, out of the social sciences, our money buckets come from science, technology, engineering, mathematics, STEM areas. Like others around, we talk about STEAM, not STEM, because we know from our own experience that engaging people in the arts engaging in various kinds of athletics are really important to the quality of activities. And for that, we need the kind of interchanges across parts of the university that this project actually makes possible. And I don't have a whole lot more to say, I think, than that for openers. There are people here who know a lot more about parts of this than I do. And
can I actually just, you made me think of a couple of other points that I wanted to share, because you mentioned, I mean, these communities might not have necessarily that much infrastructure and so on, but in reality, when we think of outreach, we tend to take a kind of patronizing role where we think that we're coming in to solve the problems of, many of these communities, when in reality, these communities, in fact, that's the reason I mentioned this issue of a level of creativity that only comes from dealing with issues of urgency, socioeconomic emergency, and so on. These agencies have become developers. I mean, these are agencies like Casa Familiar that began 30 years ago in this neighborhood, border neighborhood of San Isidro, dealing with immigrants, providing them services, because the government might not necessarily step in to do that. Now they've become really, in a way, kind of powerful, okay? I mean, they begin to purchase land, they begin to organize themselves. It's not only about social services, but it's about arts and culture programming, it's about urbanization, housing, research, and so on. And so they have spaces. And so when we met with Ramesh in the office for many times, and we thought, why not just to plug technology into already an existing infrastructure that these agencies have been able to produce. So Casa Familiar has a gallery, a warehouse they transform into a space for display and so on. And so in order to, let's piggyback a bit into those ways. So what I'm trying to say is that even though I'm an architect, I many times say, and I get in trouble with my own field, is that the future of urbanization in our time of crisis will not be led by buildings, but in fact by the reorganization of socioeconomic relations, and that we have a task as designers in producing or enabling that reorganization of resources and so on. And so I'm thinking that the community has resources, the university has resources, and I think it is about a way of kind of managing those better. And as the technology plugs into these environments, what is visualized is something that we never talk about when we talk about research. It's issues, critical issues embedded in these communities. So we thought when the technology plugs, we have to design a website, some kind of portal, and Ramesh kept talking about this, it's important, where what is amplified and visualized is that San Isidro, Casa Familiar, they have been dealing with issues of immigration, issues of housing affordability, pollution, environmental degradation, many of the topics that could be the perfect repositories of the best research developed in this university, because it seems to me that much of the research developed here is just to enable other researchers, but never translated into enabling communities, or at least activists that can produce a level of application, and so on. I'm thinking that that's really what really began to formulate a very different idea of outreach. The other aspect is this issue of public, or at least in a time when even the word public has become forbidden in this country, where any socially based effort is transformed into a communist coup, this has begun to be eroded more and more. And I'm thinking that the idea here of enabling this issue of pedagogy is a very important one. And I'm thinking that I wanted to say this because something that I have learned a lot from Mike and the efforts here is that it's not only us coming as professionals to provide something to these people who not know anything necessarily, but it's really about transforming our own procedures. So when Mike, through sociology and the kind of work that he does, or here in Calgary through technology, or the ways of conceptualizing and visualizing information through arts and so on, we begin to produce a very interesting synergy. What I've learned from Mike, I was saying, is that through activity, which inherently is what I've been interested in architecture, activity can be a way of producing or constructing community. Let's not get to what defines community here too quickly, but nevertheless, there is something about how activity programming, the very careful calibration of social interface can be designed a bit through programming. And so I'm thinking that there is an aspect here about pedagogy that enables us not only to redefine our own procedures, let's say as artists, architects, sociologists, but also thinking that the community itself begins to redefine itself, because what I found in Casa Familiar is that there is also a lot of ignorance within or embedded in this community sometimes in issues of visualizing policy, for example. In other words, it's been very interesting to work with Casa Familiar in designing workshops where we begin to demystify what density might be. So we began to design games, design a kind of artifacts, visualizations that begin to really problematize the debate. So because we continue to be entrenched in our own cliches, I think. So I'm just wanted to bring that up in terms of how this is about formulating devices that can enable another level of awareness about policy, right, about even what we mean by community and so on. And for me, it has been a huge lesson, in a sense, because probably the most interesting side of intervention as an artist or architect for me in the next years through this project is the gap itself that has been produced lately between institutions and publics, between cultural institutions and publics. And again, aspiring that I think that there could be here a potential for more and more projects dealing with this issue of, I love the, even though it sounds really romantic, but this issue of civic imagination. I think this is what has been lost more and more, primarily at a time, at this moment where, it's been so disappointing, what is going on in politics at this moment. And clearly the whole debate has been hijacked by very reductive politics of fear and so on. And I think this for me a conversation that is very critical, and I've witnessed this in Casa Familiar, that the key is really to open up new types of kind of debates, critical debates about what is the meaning of this information. So I think projects of visualization, projects of producing particular activities can really begin to get at the core of that.
Okay, thank you. So would anyone like to ask a question, comment? Yes.
Are there universities that are known for community department that do get that funded?
Well, there's a movement in the United States called the Engaged University Movement. So it's not that there are no places that take engagement with their local community seriously. I don't know if there are any R1 universities that do that. So I think it's hard to see this kind of thing taking off right now at UCSD. If you'd asked me 15 years ago, I would have said it's a great opportunity to do it. These are pretty tough times to be able to do that kind of thing in. So.
To make the argument of, it's beneficial for the undergraduate education, then you could tie it in with the community outreach.
Oh, I definitely want, yeah, I agree with you, sir.
But if there's no funding in humanities to begin with, then it would be difficult.
That's exactly right. So, I mean, the university finds itself in a bind. So Teddy, right, in his early comments, talked about the problem, how this is, the stuff, even the use of the name Community Center for Community Well-Being, a lot of people's eyelids just go down like this as soon as you say that, because it sounds like you're talking about your idea of their well-being while you're living in a nice fancy house and they're living in poverty. That's not that is not what's going on here. But for the University of California, it's a question of what sort of model of education is fundable. I think that's what the question, and where people's values are. So my strategy all along has been to try to combine undergraduate education, because the undergraduates bring an enormous amount. Those of you who've seen this know that. If you go with one part-time person working with a changing cast of 80 kids from the age of 5 to 20 by herself, how rich an environment can she create in those circumstances? Not very rich. You can sort of keep trouble from breaking out. You can help individual kids. You can sort of cool it. The undergraduates coming in transform the environment for the children and for the adults in the community who start to come around and engage us, and we engage with them around the things that they care about insofar as we can. We're actually working at Metro South because we're trying to help create a model for something like early outreach job training. And we can't go back to vocational training models in this country. Can't do any of that kind of stuff, but we might be able to come up with something new. But in order to do that, I can't send undergraduates out there and not give them an education. And to me, the best kind of education for undergraduates in the social sciences is something like a theory and practice education. So they hear some sort of idea about distributed cognition or whatever, the marvels of pushing out health games to kids on cell phones. And whatever it is that they're interested in trying to do, where's the environment that's going to be able to have, where you can actually test those ideas. So it's great for the undergraduates. And when our undergraduates write up their field notes and go through the whole thing, people write to me and say, where do you get such smart students from? Generally speaking, these are not the smartest students at UCSD, but their common sense is allowed to be able to hook up with some of the ideas at the university, and they encounter real problems. So I've been trying to leverage that kind of education. Right now, it's a very difficult thing to do. So, I don't envy our administrators in trying to hold UCSD together as a first-rate institution under these circumstances. But this kind of education, I do think, is a model. And the issue is, can we sustain it? I really don't know. That will depend upon hiring decisions that are made by departments. I don't think that the criteria for tenure and so on are going to change. I don't see any sea change in that. So I think it's going to require a quite complicated and well thought out program with some sympathetic support. And right now we're being pulled apart a little bit in this domain. It's hard to fund high quality. It's sort of easier to fund low quality. At least that's how I see it.
Anyone else? Yes.
What is the role of the community center? Oops. I'm sorry. Yes, question, ongoing interest. What role the space of the community center or community space serves in the overall community outreach process, having a place to get together as part of the overall bonding and just bringing together people in the community?
Well, obviously, it's extremely important, and not only that, it varies tremendously. And so you can't, when you're designing activities that are going to, with after school, so I'm just going to stick on the educational side of things for the moment, right? In the after school hours, if you have a very large room, right, and lots of electricity and lots of good computers and space to move around in, there's a certain set or range of activities that you can organize, which according to the theories that I use to promote development, study learning, the dynamics of learning development, would be optimal for that kind of a space. The place that we're just at Metro South, we have 3 different spaces that we use, and we're working at, actually Sarah's engaged in that process, at engaging local youth in the redesign of the space within that center. At the housing project where I work, the center is 2 apartments, 2 two-bedroom apartments connected by 2 kitchens where they push through the 2 things, right? Then you have a lot of different kinds of rooms. Then the whole design of activity issue becomes quite different than it is in a single space. But that's what I study, the relationship between the activities, the participants you can bring to bear, and the affordances of the material environment that the kids are in. So the space is important, but always contingent. You always are going to have to work around the space. I'm big on the work around things.
I wanted to bring a thread of conversation that we had quite a bit, and that is, we're thinking about a community space for the communities outside, and I think what we're trying to do a little bit with this installation is to create a space inside UCSD to think about UCSD as a community, because we've talked several times about the asset mapping that has to happen at UCSD. I think just in this room we have practicum from 6 College, we have USP. I don't think we have representative from TIES here. But just in that, and from education, we have so many people who are doing and struggling with the same issues. And maybe the next step is also to think about, in all these cases, how do we turn inward? And how do we say, we're looking at a community inside, how do we think about UCSD as a community?
It's like, Deborah, I have the following sort of thought, just a little bit on that. One is, people, within the southeastern community where I work, but also people from UCSD who have been involved in various kinds of outreach things, complain that everybody, Teddy used the term, are in silos. And when we go down to Southeastern or in other places that I've worked, you find that it's quite different. You're stepping on people's toes all the time across various kinds of local institutional lines in competition for scarce resources. So we criticize them for being in silos and say, we're coming in and we're going to be the medium within which all those walls will come tumbling down and everything's going to be wonderful, which is baloney, right? We have that problem so bad at UCSD that the fact that we're just even sitting here doing this kind of thing is sort of a 10 standard deviation event. It doesn't happen a whole lot at the time. So I have this idea that perhaps if people, in fact, we've actually observed this, when people at UCSD have to together respond to something like in a place like the South Metro Center, the people out there start to break down our silos. So I think what I would really like to see are those conditions under which you can get a kind of virtuous cycle going, in which each step that people take, I mean, we know this from quote, individual psychology, right? That the self is created through interactions with others, and it's in fact your environment that's helping to create something like a quasi-unified self. What if that's true organizationally? So I think in terms of my interest in the high technology side of this and the connectivity is to see whether or not it can enable and under what conditions that kind of virtuous cycle going. I don't know the answer to that, but then research is searching over again. I just keep searching over again for a way to do it, see if it can happen.
Can I make a couple of comments regarding the last two questions? And it's interesting because when we already began teaching some seminars in the context of the community stations. One of them, in terms of, let's say, my case with a group of visual arts students, which we took the task to begin visualizing the existing programming. So how do we begin this? Well, let's begin by understanding what these agencies are doing, how they are performing. So Casa Familiar, 52 programs, ranging from addressing issues of citizenship, how to really enable an understanding of the procedure to really, from paperwork to seniors, teens, arts and culture, all these programs that even in Casa Familiar remain very isolated from each other. So, they began to map that. Let's make it visual for the first time. It was very interesting to actually show this sort of relational map of these programs and the opportunities that begin to emerge only by that process of visualization. So we began to suggest to CASA, well, can we think of, as you teach people about citizenship, maybe that could be a way of conceptualizing issues of housing, or just to begin to mix. When we came to UCSD, it was the most problematic. The students could not begin understanding or recognizing who is doing what. There was no almost like ways of understanding who is working with communities. So it was very clear that one of the, as you probably I'm following what you were saying, is that one of the tasks here, which is a kind of self-critique, is a visualization of what we already are doing here and the types of opportunities that emerge by kind of beginning to connect the dots. And this is something that has been part of the conversation many times when we meet about this. So these issues of visualization, I think, is an important one. I'm thinking in terms of the spaces, when Casa Familiar is thinking of its gallery, let's say, which is called the front, as a kind of exhibition space of sorts. They are thinking of this as a kind of laboratory. They are thinking of this as a kind of archive where they begin to collect maps that do not exist. For example, how can we measure the amount of waste going from San Diego into Tijuana to build many of the shanty towns? How do we measure the pixelation of, let's say, immigrants coming to neighborhoods to alter existing parcels? Much of the information that is off the radar of the institution. So they are aspiring this space to be a place to construct new information. I was thinking also through the process of this issue of shifting roles, how, for example, I've been interested in a different role for art, where artists become interlocutors and translations of the invisible praxis embedded in community. So I'm interested in informal dynamics, as you are interested in activity, I'm interested in how that activity produces new conceptions of a space. Sure. So space is not static. But in other words, there's an interesting debate going on in the workshops that Casa Familiar is organizing with the community once a month. They are called Sin Límites. very interesting devices. One of them had to do with density, another one had to do with how to, when we did one of the first workshops, it had to do with identity, which is a very slippery, very strange, it's a very difficult word. We found out that in the beginning, many people in the community wanted to speak of Mexican identity as expressed through style. So many people were saying that what they wanted to have was a Costco kind of wrapped with Aztec pyramids, and even though for artists that might be interesting, that does not do anything to the sustainability of a neighborhood. So we were thinking to how do we begin to demystify that the transformation of a community begins with a style or form or how things look. Let's understand how the community operates. So we began to open up this issue of how people share space, how they negotiate boundaries, property lines, build illegally, encroach into alleys. Those operations began to be translated into devices to rethink the identity of a parcel, etc. So what I'm trying to say is that there is an issue of translation of this invisibility that from the community towards the university and from the university can really produce or make of these spaces, these community spaces, more than what we've reduced them to, which have been these sort of passive spaces where everybody agrees. But in fact, they become platforms of, at times, dissent, at times tension, when we are trying to confront images and processes and so on. I don't know if but this is what Casa Familiar aspires to make out of this gallery. And the device of the community stations in terms of its technology becomes one tool to enable these visualizations and communications.
First, Keith Pizzoli, I teach in the Urban Studies and Planning program. First, I'd like to affirm something that Deborah said that I see in what you're doing is creating community for inside the university as well. I personally have drawn inspiration, encouragement by virtue of interacting with Mike and Teddy and Deborah and Sukumar and Ramesh, because for the following reason, they're proving that engaged scholarship can be fiercely intelligent as well as engaged with the community in meaningful ways. So they dispel the myth that there has to be a divorce between scholarship and community service. That's bullshit. And this is proof right here in the pudding. And I wanted to respond to something you said, Mike, because you've been at this since 1981, and this room right now is actually much enriched by, I think, everything that you said, the perspective that you shared. And you gave kind of a little bit of a gloomy perspective on the way in which the culture of this institution's incentive structure may change, that it's not going to. And I could understand why you would say that. But I'd like to offer quickly a kind of a regional and global perspective on another way of thinking about that and what's happening. And the kind of work that Teddy's doing, too, with the others, is that we're not in Kansas anymore, in the sense that the perfect storm isn't out there looming. It's descending upon us now in terms of ecological problems, social problems, and so forth. And we're beginning to see the default scenario unfold. What's going to happen is what we thought was valuable is going to dissipate. And what was invisible in terms of value is going to emerge. You're creating what's valuable. You're creating community, capacity to work together, civic intelligence. And I think what will happen at the university level, given what's going on, is there's going to be a mounting pressure, which is going to, I think we're seeing a paradox. The pressure will be to make the university more civically engaged, but at the same time, to preserve itself. So we're going to see a balkanization, a continued balkanization around the departments, and a heaving off of interdisciplinary programs. And that's a problem. There's a real danger in that. So the fact that you're creating community within the university to deal with this change that's going to be happening is very important. Now, to be specific, I think, you, Teddy, you described a, and Mike too, this process by which this engagement can begin to feed itself in a virtuous cycle of reinforcing energy. I think as the crisis continues to unfold, the more we can bring our intelligence to identify where the new value is being created and energize that, I think this will help transform the university. And maybe new incentives will come out of that. So that's, you know, I just wanted to basically applaud the effort, recognize the value in what you're doing. And we've got a pretty sick institution on our hands, UCSD, that needs to be trained. This is the way to do it. So thank you.
I hope that, I like the optimistic view. We have other kinds of balkanization. We don't just have balkanization between departments. We don't just have it between the colleges and the departments and the disciplines. We have it between student services and the academic side of the university in a very, I think, unproductive way. And I at least just don't see my way out of it, other than trying to do demonstration proofs of the possibility of doing this and trying to figure out how to do it in a clearly economical way. I think those kinds of demonstrations are very important, because otherwise people just blow it off. I've been severely criticized for forcing my graduate students to do research in these community settings. That's true garbage. They're doing great research, professionally great research. But when you go and say, I have 5 graduate students all working in the same locale, it's like I'm telling each of them what to do, which is totally absurd. But there's a pre-existing conceptual structure that almost doesn't, heavily invested in its own truth. So maybe there will be the kind of crisis you're talking about that can have a productive outcome. I certainly hope that's the case. But it may be that it'll hive off in different ways, and we'll see not just the master plan further eroded, but other kinds of erosion. And, you know, I think what we have to do is stand there and say, you can do it better, and try to be virtuous in the university's own terms. And better than that, I personally, I have no idea what to do.
Okay, sure.
I'd like to hear you talk about your discovery of creative intelligence in these communities, and maybe tell us a story about the corridors of knowledge that are coming from the communities back to the university.
Well, part of it is what I was mentioning in terms of this understanding. Let's say for a moment, if I give you an example, I mean, I've been interested in informal economies, informal densities, informal urbanization. From the vantage point of architecture and maybe art practice, sometimes the informal is only understood as an aesthetic category. I see it more as a praxis, and I'm thinking there is something about the kind of negotiation of imposed political and economic forces that are, you know, maneuvered and sort of transformed as people construct their own space or their own ways of association or organization and so on. So there is something in those transactions. I'm interested in the kind of physical and socioeconomic and political dynamics that are embedded in shanty towns, for example, in slums in Tijuana. And even though they are ridden with problems and that are not easily reduced, you know, this whole thing cannot be reduced to a kind of glorification of the informal as a kind of solution to all ills and so on. But nevertheless, there is something behind that facade of poverty that can really be translated and extruded and therefore reconfigured into devices to intervene back into the official city. This is what I'm thinking as an architect in terms of what interests me in terms of my work. That process, though, of taking that information, that not only becomes, for me, pedagogical in nature, and this is what I've been doing with students here at times, but then interesting issues of praxis begin to emerge. And I'm thinking that's where the intelligence emerges, right? I mean, I'm thinking the kind of very natural process by which people might stitch space through waste in these environments, maybe in the way that people might come together to organize in particular ways to produce a macropolitical or economic unit. Maybe the way that 2 or 3 women might come together to enable a kind of rental into an illegal nursery, to produce an alternative economy and support, the way that that might be plugged into the nonprofit to produce a housing configuration that enables another idea of mixed use, the way that maybe 2 families might share the property line to construct all these transactions, as I was saying, you can conceive them as sort of creative acts, and therefore I many times say citizenship is particularly a creative act that reconfigures behavior and institutional protocols. And I think that is embedded there in that, but again, it needs translation. Not only needs that, but also political representation, and that's what these nonprofits do. Because many of these immigrants are illegal, but the nonprofit acts as a kind of protector and representative. So there is something there too that is an interesting aspect. But in my case, when I think of creative intelligence, I'm thinking that embedded in those transactions with boundaries, with a space, and with social organizational kind of logics, there could be a kind of DNA to rethink housing or to rethink infrastructure.
Can I give an example that just happened in the course of the last couple of months? So as we were preparing for the Political Equator event and the community stations inauguration of the technology, and actually it's interesting to think about this room, we started to work with a ties team that Mike Cole has already worked with, but now Q was starting to work with. And in the process, Keith Pizzoli was also interested in engaging Casa Familiar. So we went there together. In the course of doing that, David Flores was telling us about a study of air pollution that was initiated in the community because the federal government told them that they would not mitigate any issues of pollution that happened because of the way they were going to change the checkpoint. So cars now also going into Mexico were going to be idle. And this was a 2-year study, and they just came out with a report. So I'm there with Keith, and I hear that. We come back, and it turns out that in TIES, you have 2 types of courses that happen. One is a lab where you have a TIES team work with the community, and the other one is an Engineering 100A, which Sukumar has taught many times, and it has a bunch of students that do projects, but not as engaged. And they were looking for a project to do with Casa Familiar. So I said, hey, they're doing this air pollution study. David Flores is interested. So in spring quarter, we had, I don't know, I think 33 students working on the results of the air study pollution and trying to find ways to mitigate that. So that is an example, I think, Nancy, of a corridor that actually goes both ways.
And that's what I was mentioning before, is that it's obviously connecting the dots, because Casa Familiar got a grant to measure the pollution at the checkpoint. And all of a sudden, let's say, well, not only TIES, but before I remember Shannon, I would say this in example, was trying to develop this application through cell phones. So all of a sudden, you have resources, economic, a grant, you have the topic that is grounded in a very tangible case study, and you have the student or the researcher who has the device, but has remained abstract. Now you connect them, and I think this is where it enables this situation. This is an example that I think is very tangible.
We have a more question? Yes, yes, sir.
Yes. Hi. I like the affiliation between creativity and knowledge. And I agree with you, Teddy, about the electric character of inspiration and new knowledge that comes out of community collaboration between academia and the community. The potential is huge. We've done a lot of community organizing in San Diego over the years, at Casa and City Heights and Southeast and so on. And I've always come to the realization in doing it that sooner or later you have to get around to the economics of the environment and using the creativity and using knowledge base to transform people's economic realities, and creating economic structures. And it's very exciting to hear you talking about developing that relationship with the community. And I'm just wondering if there had been any thought about engaging with like the real estate department or people who do economic modeling to throw it into the equation as a third piece. And I think that the potential for creative economics would be really explosive when you put it next to your pedagogical experience, that the impacts on people's lives could be, I think, warp speed, move more quickly. And we care about the individuals in the communities, and the process of doing things one by one is is long-term. It's monumental, and anytime you do it with one person, it's potentially world-changing. And we've talked many times, Teddy, about the potential to change people's view of life by looking at a piece of art in a certain way or presenting an idea that just lights the light and all of a sudden. And I'm just thinking that there are ways of, and talking with Keith about economics, about ecology. I mean, we know what's running the ecology here. It's economic modeling and the pursuit of profit at the expense of, and so I'm wondering if in your process, in your dialogue, whether engaging with that side of the university is a reality, or whether the wall is so big it's like trying to talk to Bernanke about, a dollar loan or something, So that's the question.
At Metro South, the economic issues are just straight front and center. So really the stuff that we're doing is primarily trying to help amplify the workforce training for young people who've been pushed, are in the second chance group or in a variety of marginalized groups, and be able to get them to have jobs at the end. But I think getting, if we could bring the economics department into this kind of thing, great, that would be just totally cool. I haven't gotten around to the economics department, but it's of course, you need to, it's sort of like if you want to solve this problem, you're going to have to bring a lot of coordinated energy to bear on it, even in a small location. And it may be that itself will be self-defeating, that the environment will simply overwhelm it. But certainly in southeastern San Diego, where I spend time, it is an economic desert, and it's very hard for people in that desert by foot to get out of there. And that's the situation they're in.
After Sukumar, I have a comment about.
I just want to respond to your question a little bit. It's just that one of the key principles that we're working with is that the kinds of things we want to do in the community are actually driven by their priorities. So how do they define the economics? How do they do that? And then bring the expertise from the university to bear on that. So we haven't found that yet, to be very frank. What is the key thing that would qualify as economic development? Because the community is so fractured, at least the southeastern San Diego community, that we're unable to define the issues in such a way that we can bring to bear the expertise that exists within the university. So our starting point is from there, as opposed to, let's figure out what's the economic model, on this end. But that is a, kind of iterative process. We want to engage the economists and then have them work with them and so on. But like Mike said, we haven't had the opportunity yet to do that.
If I can mention something, behind much of this effort, at least from my vantage point, is the possibility of enabling this alternative economic kind of notion of sustainability, ultimately, that in terms of design, and many times I think this, again, in my own field, is that architects can, besides designing artifacts, buildings, can also design political process. We can design, economic. There is something that I discovered when I went to Metro with my students in the seminar, is that while certain agencies have to really respond to certain protocols, certain hierarchies, sequences, because of the funding they receive, they cannot step outside that boundary. Metro, for example, Career Center really brings people and trains them to really look at how to fill out forms, how to do the resume, so it's about how to insert them into the job market. So that's just one, kind of one directional. The question that emerged with my students is, why haven't they begun to capitalize on the economic entrepreneurship embedded in that neighborhood? And that would be a reversal, of the procedure, how to begin to identify these characters, how to identify the person who makes amazing Guatemalan tamales in her kitchen, or the other person how to bring them into a kind of micro association that then can enable to, themselves to produce, and then maybe a space can be designed for. All these sort of very interesting but very complex transactions is what really can enable that direction. For example, a relationship of Metro Career Center with Casa Familiar. When Casa Familiar builds its housing projects, we've been thinking of a double economy of construction, the economy of the contractor that builds the envelope, and the economy of the local labor that can really be trained and enabled and managed by Casa Familiar to build most of the kind of post-occupancy that does not require liability stuff, that the contractors usually gain by just really getting the overhead of everything. But there are many items in the construction process that don't have to be done by contractors, but the community. So this double economy of construction, entrepreneurship, all of these things need to be identified and articulated. And that's what we are not doing, I think, when we get to this issue. I mean, it's a very difficult process, but there's an aspiration that behind all this, there is another notion of economy emerging.
Teddy, if people from Metro are expecting us to
yes, we have
contact
to.
with them, as part, we have a sort of, we think we're about to connect with Metro Center as a part of the display over in the other room. And I think that they're expecting us. It's probably a good time for us to break.
So please join us in the exhibition space and also the lobby outside for.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.